This picture-perfect forest may look pristine, but 70 years ago, it was a very different story. The Clemson Experimental Forest is over 17,000 acres of woodland that has risen like a phoenix from an environmental disaster to a globally interconnected and regionally critical center of biodiversity. The amazing thing here is this place is surrounded by suburbia. How important is your suburban woodland? I hope you'll join me on today's expedition as we explore this remarkable working forest here at Clemson, where the Blue Ridge yawns its greatness.
The Clemson Experimental Forest is 17,500 acres of pastoral habitats and woodland located in the upper Piedmont of South Carolina, nearly surrounding Clemson University. The forest was largely the vision of Dr. George H. Aul, a Clemson agricultural economist. Back then, in the 1930s, this land looked nothing like it does today. It was mostly spent, highly eroded cotton fields. Through the New Deal programs, largely the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act, the land was acquired, and in 1939, Clemson assumed supervision of the property. The change has been dramatic. Today, it's an obvious green spot, even when viewed from high above. Very different from the landscape where it's nestled. The forest hosts scores of research projects. Approximately 40 university classes use the forest as an outdoor classroom, and thousands of residents use the miles of hiking trails, biking routes, horse trails, and enjoy the hunting and fishing opportunities that it provides. South Carolina is experiencing record population growth, and development claims more than 160 square miles of land each year. How important is this place to our natural heritage? Every spring as the forest greens, I'm drawn out into these woods by the flurry of bird activity as migrants return and our favorite residents sing and nest. This is one of my favorite birding spots, and it's literally right here, just outside my back door.
Migratory birds aren't the only visitors to these woods in the springtime. Here at Wildcat Creek in the North Clemson Forest, we find one of the most spectacular shows of wildflowers anywhere in the state. We have beautiful plants here at Wildcat Creek that typically we think of finding in cove forests up in the mountains. Plants like Trillium discolor, a beautiful trillium that's endemic to the Savannah River drainage. That means it's found in no other area on Earth. Trillium because it has its parts in threes. 3 leaves, 3 sepals, 3 petals, and this one, a sessile-flowered trillium. It doesn't have a clearly defined stalk that differentiates that flower from the leaves. And this one also has that wonderful clove-like scent. Beautiful spicy scent that's really hard to describe. But on warm April days, when you come out here to Wildcat Creek, the whole woods becomes perfumed with the scent of faded trillium. Now, it's only one of 3 species of trillium that make their home here in the Clemson Forest, and it's only one of 2 that are found here. Right over here we have a very different looking plant. This is Trillium Catesbyi, which is Catesby's trillium, and that one has a clearly defined stalk to the flower. Trillium Catesbyi is really typical of most mountain woodlands, but extends down into the Piedmont only to about the Clemson Forest. Doesn't go much farther south. And that's one of the special things about the place where we're at. This site, Wildcat Creek in fact, is one of the most diverse wildflower sites you could ever visit in the springtime. This one slope, we came out here and we measured out an area 20 meters wide by 50 meters long. That's 1/10 hectare. And when we counted the different types of plants that occur in that 20 meter by 50 meter area, we came up with 154 species of plants. That's pretty special. That makes Wildcat Creek the most diverse forest I know of in the eastern United States on that spatial scale. Well, why is it so diverse? That's one of the questions that you have to ask here. This isn't an old growth forest. It's been cut over. It still has well-developed soil, but I think the key here lies in the fact that the Clemson Forest straddles the border between Piedmont and mountains. So we have typical Piedmont things like redbud. We have typical mountain things like buffalo nut. And at Wildcat Creek, we have that very special geology, amphibolite, that magical rock that when it breaks down, forms those high pH soils. And here at Wildcat Creek, we have a mixture of high calcium, high magnesium, high pH soil, and little areas and pockets of acid soil. And when we get that mixture, you get things that grow on acid soil sites, things that grow on basic soil sites, things that like it in between, and you get no overpowering show of any one species. So here, even though it doesn't look as lush as some other sites that you might find in the mountains, we actually have one of the most tremendous diversities that you'll find in eastern North America. Many times, the rarest plants aren't necessarily the most beautiful plants. And we've got some really good examples of that right here at Wildcat Creek. This one is a great one to illustrate that point. This is a plant that is usually called leech brush or pirate bush, Nestronia umbellulata. Definitely not the most beautiful flowering bush out here in this forest. It's sort of nondescript with these opposite elliptic entire leaves and little tiny green flowers. But this is a very uncommon plant, globally and in South Carolina. This plant is actually what we term a hemiparasite. Now, hemi means partially. This one is usually parasitic on pine trees, and that means that it's pulling some of its nutrients and some of its water from its host plant, from the pine. In this case, it's probably this huge shortleaf pine. It's right up behind us here. This plant goes unnoticed a lot of times in the woods, and it's actually more abundant than we used to think, but it's often overlooked. You can tell it from most plants in the forest by those opposite leaves. One plant that also has opposite leaves that sometimes gets confused with Nestronia is this one that's right here with it. This is sweet shrub. And sweet shrub, again, has opposite elliptic entire leaves. They look very similar to the Nestronia when you compare them side by side. A little darker, but one good key feature for the sweet shrub is that the leaves and pretty much all parts of this plant, when you squish them and you smell them, they smell a bit like Concord grape. And if it's the spring of the year and this plant is flowering, there's no way in the world you're going to misidentify that beautiful, very primitive looking, lacy flower and all these little strap-like nondescript petals. Either they smell beautiful, they smell like Concord grapes, or sometimes they smell like dead rotting fish or rotten meat. And both of those scents apparently are there to attract the primary pollinators of this plant, which in this case are flies. But again, a lot of the rare plants that are here are not the most beautiful plants you see here. Things like the Biltmore's carrion flower, and one of my favorites out here, the Seneca snakeroot, Polygala seneca. Smallish, whitish colored flowers. You want to see this plant, you come to Wildcat Creek, and I promise you, you see lots of rare plants, you see lots of beautiful plants too, and it's just a great example of how important this Clemson Experimental Forest is for preserving the biodiversity of South Carolina.
Tracts of undeveloped land, even suburban woodlots, can be extremely important habitat for birds. To explore the importance of the Clemson Forest to bird life, I meet up with my friend and colleague, Dr. Drew Lanham, Clemson University ornithologist, and we head out into the forest for a morning filled with birds.
Been to Wildcat Creek many a time, but never to look at birds. Usually it's to look at plants, but this time of the morning there's birds everywhere around us, including what has to be
unmistakable.
Colin. Yep.
Jet black wings, just, well, scarlet red body, scarlet tanager.
Scarlet
right?
tanager.
And just an absolutely gorgeous bird, just putting on the full show out here.
That bird is high up in the tree, and that's where I usually see him. And I usually see him in this habitat. And we're in the interior of a large block of forest here.
Yeah, they're forest interior migrants. Birds that depend on, as you said, Patrick, those large, unbroken tracts of forest, and they're pretty sensitive to fragmentation. That is, breaking up the habitat and kind of isolating it.
Right.
And so those birds need a lot of space, a lot of elbow room, or in this case, wing room, so to speak.
Yeah. Scarlet tanager also is a great bird for us to look at here right off the bat, because that's a neotropical migrant.
Yeah, and neotropical migrants really are this whole class of birds that we're concerned about, because they really kind of live these two disparate lives. Part of their lives, they live here in North America, breeding, But most of their lives they spend down in the tropics.
Yeah, northwestern South America this is flying back to, right?
Yeah, he's way down there, so I mean that brightly colored bird really fits in with that tropical avifauna.
Yeah.
But making a tremendous trip back here just probably a couple of weeks ago across the Gulf, braving all of the things that can knock a bird down, this bird is back here doing its business.
Amazing. The fact that these birds are really living two different lives, one here and one in the tropics, makes conservation pretty difficult with these, doesn't it?
Yeah, it makes it doubly difficult, Patrick, in that, you know, what we have to do here is to try to protect large tracts of forest like this so that birds like scarlet tanagers have a place to successfully nest. But then we also have to worry about the habitat in between here
Yeah,
and the wintering grounds in the tropics, and we all know what's going on in the tropics.
exactly.
And so large blocks of tropical forest also have to be preserved.
Now that's a long distance migrant, but I got one that I've been watching out of the corner of my eye the whole time we were talking. Take a look right up here and tell me.
There?
See, they look like a black and white warbler running up the river birch.
Yeah.
Not a black and white warbler,
no,
right?
it's not. Look at that black cap on it.
Right?
It's a blackpoll.
A blackpoll warbler.
Whoa.
Now that takes the scarlet tanager story to the extreme, right? Blackpoll warblers, these birds don't stick around here. Those birds go far to the north, to the actual meeting place of the tundra and the taiga. So way up on the north slope of Canada and Alaska. And that's a bird that migrates up to 8,000 miles, right? From Alaska to Brazil.
I mean, that's incredible to even see that bird here, and you think about the tremendous distance that it's come
Right.
from Brazil here, and a good portion of its fall migration, we know at least, is over the ocean.
3,000 miles made without a stop to reach South America, and that's pretty unbelievable.
This bird obviously has evolved over a period of time to be able to do this.
And that's one of the things I guess they do. They bulk up right before they leave.
Yeah, this hyperphagy, this heightened eating where you just go on this binge. And birds are really good at taking a lot of the stuff that they eat and converting it into this fat. And if you catch one of these birds, you have them in hand, you can softly kind of blow apart the breast feathers. And in migration, you can really kind of tell what condition that bird is in based upon the amount of fat that it kind of has sitting in there in its breastbone. So really miraculous. That
And they're really emaciated when they make it here. They have to feed up really, really good when they get here. That's just a neat bird, just a super story.
No fewer than 36 species of warbler have been spotted using the Clemson Experimental Forest, and at least 15 are known to breed here. Some are on their way to the nearby mountains of the Carolinas, like the black-throated blue, the Canada warbler, and the chestnut-sided. But others are only halfway to their summer home, like the magnolia warbler. This is a bird that likes much scrubbier places than those that we've seen this morning. We're headed to a very different habitat, not quite so pristine, but still very important for bird diversity.
Well, we're out of that forest, or partially out. We're sitting here on the edge of the forest, and we got totally new bird species. And the one that I saw here the other day and still sitting right here, that tree, can you believe that one?
Oh, sweet. Must be on territory here.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful?
Baltimore Oriole?
Baltimore Oriole. What a beautiful bird. Probably my favorite bird in this area. Look at him, he's just sitting there preening for us and singing.
Well, yeah, I mean, you hear that song, those kind of slurred whistles and that chattering.
Yeah.
That's actually a blackbird. It's related to blackbird.
It's a blackbird?
Yeah, it's an icterid. It's a very pretty icterid, but...
Interesting. I didn't know Orioles were blackbirds, but now blackbirds, these guys are frugivores, right? They nectar and fruit. Well, and insects. He's obviously catching insects up there too, but that seems different from blackbird.
And Orioles are a very diverse group of birds, but they're going to eat insects and feed insects to their young because they need that protein. But you know, you could put out orange halves and other kinds of fruit as your feeding station, and you can actually get those birds in to your yard, because most of our yards kind of qualify as edge habitat.
Yeah, and this is the habitat that this bird really loves. This is the forest edge, and they're, I guess, on the upswing because they love suburban neighborhoods. When I was a kid, I mean, we basically only saw these birds along big rivers, bottomland open cottonwood forests, where I used to see them up in the mountains in North Carolina. A lot of the birds in here too.
It is. Warblers too. Hold up. Look up there. right up there.
Yeah, a couple warblers. I actually know that warbler. That's the Yellowrump Warbler, Myrtle Warbler, right?
Yeah, that's the Yellowrump. You'll hear birders refer to that bird as a butterbut.
Yeah,
sometimes.
which is a good name for it.
It's a good name.
When he turns around just like that, you can just see the yellow on the rear end. Now, what's he doing here? I thought they wintered here. I see them at my feeder even in the wintertime.
Yeah, that bird's kind of late. They'll be pulling out of here pretty soon. They're headed to regions north of here, primarily in Carnivorous Forest.
Right.
It's a bird that in our state, I haven't been seeing as many of them around during the wintertime, and most of them apparently are on the coast.
Is that a Cape May?
So you know your warblers pretty well, Patrick. That is Dendroica tigrina. That's a Cape May Warbler,
Okay.
and you see that orangish cheek patch on that,
Right,
pretty male,
right.
and the streaking tigrina, that
Yeah.
tiger stripes
So
there.
Cape May warblers certainly don't breed here, right? Those are
No.
far north.
Yeah, that bird's heading again to spruce fir forests where it makes use of a pretty cyclical resource, spruce budworm, like a bunch of other
Right,
warblers do.
Right. I know that bird because we get them on campus occasionally, some
Yeah.
springs, but I don't see it every spring. And I'm just wondering, this is the second warbler that's really just transient that we've seen here. Saw the black poll nose, seen the Cape May. Are these warblers always on the same route? Do we get the same warblers every year? What's going on there?
Well, you know, you largely get the same kind of group of warblers that come through and other migrants, but they might come through in different numbers relative to one another. And sometimes, in some years when the weather's really good, these birds push right over us. They're not being
Right,
pushed down by
right.
bad weather, so.
That's a really neat bird, and it sort of makes you appreciate how important having these large green spaces in the Piedmont of South Carolina, like Clemson Forest, how important they are for even transients.
Yeah, it is. I mean, to have that habitat, whether it's edge like this or mature forest like we've already been in, to have that habitat to stop, rest, feed, so you
Yeah.
can continue the next leg of the journey is critically important.
Yep. You got one more place to take me?
Yeah, but Patrick, it's not going to be quite as pretty as the places that we've seen here, but it's going to be real birdy.
Cool.
The comedian among the warblers has to be the yellow-breasted chat. It's so odd that we're not even really sure that it's a warbler. The strange calls and displays, combined with the yellow breast, give it its common name.
Well, Patrick, we're in a place now that it's not much to look at, but it's really important for bird life.
Yeah, it's one of these scruffy areas in second growth forest and early successional community. And what we mean by early successional community is it's a place where the canopy's been removed. And a lot of times we look at these places and we think it's been devastated. But in fact, I mean, this is a place where you find some of the most beautiful birds in North America and in the world. And they're important bird habitats.
Well, extraordinarily important because they provide so much structure. All of this scrubby stuff that you see here, from grasses and forbs down low to shrubs and then a few young trees, provide a lot of different levels for bird to exist.
Yeah, and we've got birds singing all around us here, even though it's getting a little late in the morning now. But right up here, this has got to be one of my favorites, right up in that little red maple over there. Just beautiful. I guess they've just molted and changed color because it's hard to believe that that American goldfinch is the same goldfinch that comes to my feeder in the wintertime.
Well, wild canaries is what people
Right.
have called them in the past, but that lemon yellow color and those jet black wings are just exquisite.
Yeah.
And those birds, a lot of people mistake them in the wintertime for a different species because they're really drably colored.
Right. And they're the only finch I know of in this area that actually changes color.
In the eastern United States,
Yeah.
they are. American goldfinches really aren't setting up territories early like other birds are, and that's because they depend on a pretty unique and not exactly attractive food
Come on,
source.
it's pretty to me. Thistles, right? And actually kind of an attractive species. It's not totally ugly, and certainly it attracts some beautiful, beautiful birds. These finches love it. And because it blooms in late spring through summer, I guess these finches delay their breeding to correspond with when food's available.
Yeah, when food's available, but they also take that down and they use that in the nests.
Yep.
And so it makes a nice, soft, cushy nest for the young, and they're getting a food resource out of it too.
That's
So
a very cool bird and a very cool plant that, you might pull it up, but if you want to keep those beautiful goldfinches around, you need to keep a few thistles around in the neighborhood too.
Patrick, hold on, right up here. This is the bird that I cut my teeth on. That buzzy little song up there on that branch, it's kind of out of place, but that's a Prairie Warbler. That tree's in the middle of all of this stuff.
Right.
And so that bird is just taking advantage of caterpillars and other insects on that fresh green foliage. But again, that bird is probably going to make a territory and hopefully a nest
Right.
somewhere in this scrubby early successional habitat.
That bird is actually one that is currently in decline.
It is, along with quite a few other early successional birds, birds that depend on this habitat that we're standing in the middle of. Prairie warblers, yellow-breasted chats, birds like that need these ephemeral habitats.
Ephemeral means short term or short lived.
Yeah.
They're not here forever.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when a forest disappears, whether because man cuts it down or whether a storm comes in and takes it out,
Yeah.
you have a few years where that habitat is really suitable for something like a prairie warbler or a chat.
So you need grass seeds and you need scruffy areas. So keeping a little bit of this early successional community in your neighborhood is essential if you want some of the most beautiful birds in North America to be among the birds that visit your backyard.
Absolutely.
Well, I've got a songbird of my own I'd like to show you. Something that lives in a little moister habitat. So
Let's take a look.
go take a look at that. It's a nice big water snake taking off there, isn't it?
Yeah, found the perfect sunny spot.
Yeah. But check this out, Drew. I lied to you. They're not really songbirds, but I sort of consider these to be the warblers of the stream. Those are just indescribable, aren't they?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out which crayon out of my box of 64 I would label these fish with. This is absolutely incredible. What are they doing here?
Well, this is a breeding aggregation of Yellowfin Shiners. And even though we call them Yellowfin Shiners, here in the upper Savannah River drainage, they have orange fins. And a beautiful little kind of smoky bluish white mask on the face. And it's just one of the most beautiful shiners that exist anywhere. And they're actually probably the most common shiner here in the upper small tributaries of the Savannah River. Natropus lutepinnus, even the scientific name means yellow fin. And these guys, the brightly colored ones, are all males. And you'll notice they're all clumped around this little pile of stones. And that pile of stones is a nest. Just like cuckoos lay their eggs in other birds' nests, these guys are actually laying their eggs on the nest of another fish. In this case, it's the bluehead chub, which is a very common, large, minnow-like fish that lives here in these streams. And the chub actually builds that nest. These fish are attracted to that nest and spawn over top of the nest. And the chub itself will provide protection for the nest because it patrols this area and will keep predators away from the nest. So it actually protects the eggs of these shiners. Now, unlike cuckoos and cowbirds, they're not going to push out the chub's eggs out of that nest. They're just in there breeding on top of the chub's nest. They're not going to harm the chub. They're not going to harm the chub's eggs at all. So it's just amazing. These guys will color up like this only for a few days, a few hours. And you have to be out here this time of year, late April through May, really to see this. And you have to be here at just the right time to catch these guys. But man, when they're fired up, it's really something else, isn't it?
It's like fire in the water.
It really is.
Absolutely beautiful.
We'll let them continue spawning, but that's really one of the true miracles that you find out here in the streams in the Clemson Forest.
Thanks for showing it.
Yeah.
One of the great things about the Clemson Forest is that it's not very far away. It's right at the border of the university, close enough that we can become intimately familiar with its resources. It's a place you can take the time to enjoy day after day.
Well, my graduate student, Matt Johnson, found something pretty cool right here yesterday, which he instructed me I had to look at. When he turned over this rock, he found something that's still there, a big mass of eggs. And if you look at these eggs up close, pour a little water on them, keep them wet, and you'll notice that they're moving. Well, these are eggs of a very large salamander, one of the most aquatic of the lungless salamanders that we have, the blackbellyied salamander. It's Desmognathus quadrimaculatus. That's a salamander that I usually think of being up high in the mountains. But Clemson Experimental Forest is located right there at the transition between the Piedmont and the mountains. So we get species like blackbellyied salamanders, Metcalf salamanders, Ocoee salamanders, seal salamanders, all those things that we think of as being in the Blue Ridge, we get them down here in the upper Piedmont. Many of them are right at their extreme southern limit. The Jordan's or Metcalf salamander is at not only its southern limit, but also its elevational limit, down below 600 feet here. So it's just incredible. These mountain things are able to make a living here, really where their range peters out, the ends of the range and at the edge of their tolerance. So a very neat salamander, and it's one of the reasons why this experimental forest is so important. We have many, many miles of headwaters that are preserved here, and each one of these headwater streams here in the North Forest supports populations of salamanders at the very limit of the range. And those species at the limit of the range are oftentimes the most important ones for dealing with changes in the climate and dealing with creation of new species, speciation. So yet another reason why this Clemson Experimental Forest is so important. Miles and miles of neat, clean headwaters.
In total, over 200 miles of streams are found in the Clemson Forest. The streams, like the forest, have seen changes, declining with the near loss of the forest in the early 20th century, and now thriving again. Even some long-gone residents, like the turquoise darter, are making a comeback, thanks to a helping hand from Clemson researchers. Change has always been a part of the forest. Join me next time as we continue to explore a changing landscape and the jewel of the Upper Piedmont, the Clemson Forest.
Many people, when they visit the Deep South on vacation, drive through what to them appears to just be a monotonous expanse of pine forests, when in fact, this is one of the rarest habitats left on Earth. If you've been lucky enough to see a stand of longleaf pine like the one behind me, you've been lucky enough to view a forest that has been reduced to just 2% of its historic extent. It's filled with some of the strangest and most beautiful plants and animals anywhere on the globe. Most of it has adapted to fire. Join me on today's expedition as we explore the Appalachicola National Forest, a land kissed by fire.
The Appalachicola National Forest consists of over 1/2 million acres located in the Florida Panhandle of the East Gulf Coastal Plain. This region has been recognized as one of the 5 richest biodiversity hotspots in the country. A single county here, Liberty County, is home to 1,694 documented species of vascular plants alone. Not only are there many, many species here, but they're extremely cool ones. The route down from my home in South Carolina takes us along the Appalachicola River, and a chunk of the diversity that today calls this region home has also used this corridor for their travel in the past.
One of the major reasons for all of the diversity, and especially the endemism, the plants and animals that are only found here and nowhere else, is right here. This is the Appalachicola/Chattahoochee River. And this river makes a beeline right from the mountains of North Georgia all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And that connection between the mountains and the coast has played a huge role in the life that lives here today. Here along this massive river, not only do we have big deposits of silt from past flooding that comes up that gives us a rich soil, but we also cut through an area of limestone rocks, which allows plants to grow here that need high pH soil that's rare in the coastal plain areas. Right along the banks of this river, we're finding some really neat species that we don't think of growing anywhere except on these high pH soils. Things like bluff oak, Quercus austrina, and roughleaf dogwood, which looks just like some other southern dogwoods, but the leaves are extremely rough, and it's only found where you find high pH soil. So here along the Appalachicola and the Chattahoochee, the high soil pH plus that connection with the mountains has allowed us to develop a plant community unlike any other. During really cold times, like during the ice ages, plants will be pushed out of the Appalachians and they find a natural corridor for movement right down these rich river valleys. And then during the warm times, they'll use this corridor to migrate back up into the Appalachians. But sometimes plants get stuck down here. And these are plants that have their origins, their roots, in forests that are much like the Appalachians. But today, these plants are only found here along the Appalachicola and Chattahoochee.
We leave the cool fire-protected forest behind for the open, sunny habitats of the Appalachicola itself. Fire is intimately tied to the life and diversity of this place. Here in Florida, only a few inches in elevation can make the difference between being in a sandhill with turkey oak and wiregrass and being in the moist flatwoods. Regardless of the moisture, endemics, species that can only be found in this region, are everywhere. And even common plants can appear quite uncommon in the Appalachicola.
Southern Botanical Oddities 101. Even the sunflowers are weird here. Take a look at this. These really weird plants with just 4 leaves plastered flat against the ground, believe it or not, are sunflowers. A whole road bank here, just completely littered with them. Not only bizarre because of those 4 flattened leaves, but also bizarre because of the flowers. Rayless sunflowers composed of these really dark discs. The thing that looks like a petal on an actual sunflower, that's not a petal at all. It's actually a flower in its own right. But these lack them. Even our old road bank through the sandhills can be super cool in the Appalachicola. It's kind of ironic. I told my cameraman at lunch we were going to find a pygmy rattlesnake, and guess what? We found a pygmy rattlesnake, a dusky pygmy rattlesnake. And it may seem a little ironic, but it's not unexpected here in the Appalachicola. When I was working down here frequently, I used to find these on pretty regular occasion. There's a pretty dense population of pygmy rattlesnake here. A beautiful color face with the grayish body with darker spots, and then this nice russet band that runs right down the back. Up a little farther north, you find the Carolina pygmy rattlesnake. But down this far south, strictly dusky pygmies. One of the smallest pit vipers in the world. This animal is venomous, and you want to give it a wide berth. As a matter of fact, here in Appalachicola, we have 3 species of rattlesnake alone. Diamondbacks, canebrakes, and this guy. You may think that Texas or Arizona hold the crown when it comes to snakes in the United States, but in fact, right here in the panhandle of Florida, where there are 42 species of snakes, is the highest diversity of snakes in an area of this size anywhere in North America.
Everywhere you look here, you seem to find plants that can be found nowhere else. Some are among the rarest on the planet.
This dainty yellow flower just happens to be the very last Harpers Beauty flower in bloom this year in Florida. I know that because this species is only found right here in and around the Appalachicola National Forest in Florida. So actually, this is the last one blooming in the wild anywhere on Earth. Now, how would I know that? Well, I know it because I just happened to run into Florida Natural Areas Inventory biologist, Amy Jenkins. And Amy has just got done surveying all 132 known sites for this plant in this 3-county area, Bay, Gulf, and Liberty counties. This area that surrounds the Appalachicola National Forest. And by far, the majority of these plants are right here along this highway in the edge of the road to where the swamps, thickets, and flatwoods begin. Isn't it incredible that the only relatives, the only other species of Harpericola are found in South America in the Guyanas? For the longest time, this plant was only known from one roadside population south of the small town below us here, Sumatra, and that population consisted of only about 31 plants. Well, intensive survey efforts all over this area has turned up now 132 known sites, and Amy tells me that about 85 of those she's able to relocate and are extant, and that's a lot better future than this plant had at one time. It's probably around 8,000 plants worldwide of this species today, and it really illustrates how important this area is to preserving what is truly uniquely Floridian and what's uniquely American. There are so many other species that, just like Harpericola, are found just here, the East Gulf coastal plain, the panhandle of Florida. Well, this is quite a contrast to most of the little flowers that are specialist Appalachicolas. I mean, what more would you want in a flower? This is a spider lily, Hymenacalis. It's related to daffodils, the specialist of just this area. This is Henry's spider lily. If you take a close look at the flower, you can see the similarities to a daffodil. You see, the white part that looks like petals here, these aren't actually petals. These are fused stamens. That's where the anthers are held, out here on the ends of these. And the bases are fused together to form what we call a corona. And that's just like the trumpet of a daffodil. So what are actually the quote-unquote petals, we call them tepals in monocots like this, are these green appendages here. The fact they're green is how I know that this is a Henry spider lily. It looks a lot like a giant daffodil. Matter of fact, its relatives are called Peruvian daffodils, often in the trade. And in the United States, the highest concentration, the highest diversity per unit area is right here in the Gulf coastal plain of Florida. And just like the Harpers Beauty, this plant is considered a rare species. They don't get much more pleasing than this enormous white flower pollinated by moths that belongs to Henry's spider lily.
You may think of dry sites being open and sunny, but here, where fire is frequent, even the moistest of locations support open, sunny, and incredibly diverse landscapes.
It's hard to imagine a more beautiful and maybe bizarre habitat than this one. All we need to do is go down just a little bit in elevation on fine textured soils, kind of silty soils here, and you end up with this incredible habitat that we call a wetland savanna over most of the range of longleaf pine at least. Wetland savannas are exactly what they sound like. They're scattered trees, and they can be longleaf pine like we have here. Here in the Appalachicola region, they're oftentimes joined by slash pine, sometimes by gum trees, and typically also, regardless of where you're at, a few pond cypress tend to sneak in to this habitat. And the thing that sort of defines these wetland savannas is the presence of carnivorous plants. This is their favorite habitat. This low pH, highly acidic, nutrient poor, and saturated soil. So this incredible display around us of yellow trumpets is typical of what we think a wetland savanna being. Savannas are absolutely beautiful all year long, but particularly if they've been burned. This savanna was just burned a month and a half ago, and already, only in about 6 weeks' time, the pitcher plants have blossomed out, they've flowered, they're out here with these huge trumpets, huge leaves, but they're joined by an incredible chorus of wildflowers. Things like the meadow beauty, that's beautiful with upright flowers, Rexia petiolata, and even the yellow-flowered meadow beauty. Some of my favorite charismatic smaller plants out here are the hat pins, the bog buttons, even bantam buttons, a cute, smaller, and densely flowered monocot with these adorable white clusters of flowers. This is also the habitat where we see a lot of orchid species, and right now it's a perfect time to see large numbers of the pale grass pink orchid. Incredible display of wildflowers. But those species are joined by ones that you can only find here in the deep south, like parrot pitcher plant. Each one of those pitchers is modified to look like the beak of a parrot. Really interesting plant. And here in the Appalachicola region, we are in one of the centers of endemism and diversity. And here in the savannas, we're seeing that. Here's a good example right here in front of me, the little grass-leafed coneflower with these little burgundy, beautiful flowers, Rudbeckia graminifolia, and it's a specialty in the East Gulf Coastal Plain. Much in the way that fire keeps out woody vegetation in the uplands here, where we have finer textured, wetter soils, it's actually sometimes just the grass and the thatch that builds up that leads to a loss of diversity here. So when we look at this habitat, you can see everything is visible now, the year that it's burned. But in just a year or two without fire, that changes dramatically.
So much diversity. But why are there so many species here?
The real reason why there's so many endemics here, so many species are found only here, and there's so much diversity, is because of size. You see here, it's a matter of scale. The incredible amount of land here that is occupied by savannas and fire-maintained habitat, that's one of the reasons that there's so many special things here. You see, when you have an island, and really a wetland savanna like I'm in right now is an island of moist, fire-maintained, open, sunny habitat amidst a sea of higher, drier habitat. And these islands have to conform to all of the rules that govern diversity and endemism, unique species on islands. It's called island biogeography. And one of the tenets of that is the larger the island, the more likely you are to get species, the more likely you are to maintain species, and the less likely they are to go extinct on that site, and the more likely you are to actually develop unique ones through time. And when islands are close together, that also tends to help stabilize those communities and add to the species richness of island archipelagos. And what we have here in the Appalachicola National Forest is the largest archipelago of wetland savannas and longleaf pine savannas anywhere in the world remaining today. And that's not a new thing. These savannas, these systems, we know they've been here a long time because we have unique species that are developed here. Everywhere you look, you find things that are just special to this East Gulf Coastal Plain. I don't know of anywhere else in the world today where where you can go and you can see savannas like this, stretching not just an acre, 2 acres, but to the horizon. Here in the Appalachicola, we don't measure our pitcher plants by the tens or hundreds. We count the pitcher plants in the millions. The diversity of plants here in the Appalachicola is unbelievable. The diversity of carnivorous plants is unbelievable. But sometimes you're blown away by even just the diversity that you see within a single species. And I just walked through a series of different clones of yellow pitcher plant, and they look entirely different. As a matter of fact, if you didn't know better, you'd think that this was a completely different species than the solid green or solid yellow ones that are right next to me here. And what we're looking at here is genetic diversity. Diversity of genes mixing through this population of different color forms, not different species. Just like blondes, redheads, and brunettes, pitcher plants also have different color patterns in their leaves. And so here, the yellow pitcher plant, Sarracenia flava, I love this spot because we can actually see where a successful seedling here started this colony of all deep, dark, red trumpeted yellow pitcher plant. And you can tell all these are probably the same genetic individual, all connected at one time in the past by the rhizome sort of snaking through this habitat and creating this patch that all has the same color. And then we look right over here, and all of these have a completely clear greenish yellow trumpet with just a spot of purple right on the back of that backboard, the hood of the yellow pitcher plant. Those probably also represent a colony of just one genetic individual. And then right here, my favorite color form, this incredible bicolored, completely red, almost chalky trumpet with a greenish yellow red vein top. And again, one discrete colony, 3 discrete seedlings in the past creating these colonies. And you start to take a look around and the diversity is so much greater than that. But right here, this is a great place to see these individual clones and see how much genetic diversity really exists in this population. But if you think this is a lot of pitcher plants, probably more pitcher plants than you've ever seen in one spot, just wait till you see what's right up ahead. Sometimes there just aren't words. Enjoy the most exceptional pitcher plant population that I know of here on planet Earth. Unbelievable. An owl fly, things you never see, you see in the Appalachicola. I've only seen a couple of these in my life and I really know almost nothing about them except how weird they look. It's easy to get a little bit distracted by all of these incredible yellow trumpets that are so many colors out here in this expansive savanna. If you get distracted by them and don't notice the rest of the life around you, you're really missing out because just in this one savanna, just in a short walk, I've counted 16 different species of carnivorous plants. 16. And some of those, you have to come here to the East Gulf coastal plain to see. And 3 of the strangest of these carnivorous plants are right here. The first one of these looks like a sundew that's been stretched out. In fact, it is. This is thread dew, with these glistening, crazy, tentacle-like leaves. You can tell it's a sundew because of the way the leaves unfurl. All species of sundew, actually everything in the family of sundews, unfurls with the same sort of what we call vernation. That's the way a leaf unfurls that you see in ferns. So these incredible little fiddleheads are one of the characteristics of the family of sundews, and this one shows that same circinate vernation. And when you look at the leaves, all those glistening droplets along that leaf are the lure that's going to bring insects in to this carnivorous plant. And when they get close to those droplets, they get stuck to them. This species is particularly adept at catching teeny tiny little insects
things like gnats and midges, tiny things that most of these other plants would just overlook, this one specializes in. Once they come close and get attached to those droplets of mucilage, they get stuck like flypaper. And those little tiny trichomes, the hair-like structures that the glistening droplet is attached to, actually bend down towards the leaf surface itself and smash that little gnat up against the surface of the leaf, where protease, esterase, amylase, all these enzymes, but particularly protease, goes to work breaking down the protein in the body of that little tiny insect, and again, absorbing the nitrogen that's so important in building the proteins that build that plant. The thread-dew, or Tracy's threadleaf sundew, is a specialist just here at the Gulf Coastal Plain with these pale, ghostly leaves. Well, a couple others. This one, believe it or not, is a pitcher plant. And this is a parrot pitcher plant with these beautiful reddish leaves. These traps are quite a bit different from any of the other pitchers out here because the hole is concealed. You have to look way down here in sort of the hood on this pitcher plant to find the opening, and it's very tiny. The rest of the pitcher is covered with these white dots that allow light in. And what this plant is actually doing is shading the escape route and allowing light in all around the rest of the pitcher to confuse insects. Once they get into the trap, they have a hard time making their way out. It's almost like an old minnow trap that you might have used in streams when you were a kid to catch minnows. There's one way in and very little chance you'll ever get out once you're in this trap. It's a passive trap. It's not doing anything other than trapping the little insects, usually, again, tiny things like ants in that tube, breaking them down and utilizing the nitrogen. Incredible plants. And the third one, and a real specialty just here in the East Gulf Coastal Plain, is this one right here. This is a butterwort, and it's one of the largest species of butterworts on the planet. It's one of those groups of carnivorous plants that most people overlook. Butterworts just look like little stars just plastered down against the ground. But if you look closely at their leaves, they're covered with sticky mucilaginous secretions, just like the sundew. And those sticky surfaces attract, again, with that reddish coloration, insects. And tiny insects, midges, gnats, land on this. And when they do, they get stuck, they die. And then slowly, sometimes, the leaves curl around them. And again, the process begins of digestion, whether the leaves are curled around or whether they're stuck flat against the surface. The glands that they're held up against, those glands are going to secrete protease, breaking down the insect into the nitrogen that the plant uses for the amino acids that are the building blocks of the protein. And that really cool butterwort plant is one that you have to come here to the East Gulf Coastal Plain to see. The diversity of carnivorous plants here is almost unparalleled anywhere in the world. Even though these cypress trees are extremely small, extremely short, this is an old growth cypress stand. It's never been cut. And even though these cypress may only be 6, 7, 8 feet tall, some of them, those 8-foot tall trees may be around 300 or more years old. It's really cool here in the Appalachicola region when we get an area where the land has sunk down just a little bit below the level of the savanna. It becomes waterlogged all year, and that provides a perfect condition for cypress trees to grow. And here where we have these stunted cypress, it's usually because either bedrock is really close to the surface, or like here, there's a heavy layer of clay underlining the shallow peat and sand of this depression just below the water. So it's a really cool system we call a clay-based lime sink or a clay-based depression. And the result is that the cypress trees become natural bonsais. They just simply can't put on the height that they would in a deeper soiled site. So these cypress forests are really rather characteristic of the low areas throughout the Appalachicola, at least where they're not connected to waterways. What we call cypress ponds. And the pond cypress is the type of cypress that's growing here in these low-lying areas. So if we look at this cypress, you may notice it doesn't really look much like the bald cypress that you're probably familiar with. The needles are way different. And actually these are branchlets. They're little tiny branches with the needles oppressed to the stem, and they're ascending, stuck right up in the air instead of fanning out to the side like a bald cypress. And so the scientific name Taxodium ascendens refers to the fact that those branchlets, what appear to be leaves, are pointing straight up. They're ascending. And pond cypress is found, guess where? In these ponds. It's not in deep alluvial soil along major riverways, but actually in these isolated depressions where the nutrient levels are really low, it's highly acid, it's saturated all the time. And again, you usually have some hard layer down there that's preventing them from growing their roots deep down into the soil, whether that's bedrock or clay. And that results in them growing only 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches a year in height. And so we have these ancient bonsaied forests. It's really not that different from a huge bald cypress forest in many respects, because we've seen cottonmouths out here feeding, we've seen banded water snakes, we've even seen pig frogs. And just like in an old growth bald cypress forest, some of the birds are the same. Matter of fact, the birds that have been screaming all around me here are prothonotary warblers. And I've never seen a place where you could view prothonotary in such excellent open conditions, right out in the light. And we've watched them this morning bathing and singing, displaying on territory and feeding. It's just an incredible place to see prothonotary warblers. The canaries of the swamp, the extent here, just like everything in the Appalachicola, is almost beyond belief. They're huge stands of dwarf forests.
All this diversity is tied to a long history that includes frequent fire. Where did all the fire come from? Well, certainly before we built numerous fire breaks, such as roads and neighborhoods, a single wildfire could burn a significant amount of land. But we now know that the native people of the region purposely set fire to these lands to encourage the grass and the growth that encouraged the wildlife that they depended on for food. The thousands of years that native people burned no doubt shaped the landscape that we've inherited today. Our choice, the choice not to burn much of our landscape, has changed our world just as dramatically. And the plants and animals that have adapted to this habitat are now at great risk.
It seems that even here, in the strangest of places, human beings have had a hand in shaping what we consider to be natural. This place is truly unique. I mean, really unique. I go everywhere in the world, and I can tell you, this is one of the world's great ecosystems. The Appalachicola has been a place that has been both kissed by fire and blessed with it. When you visit, I hope you'll tread lightly and also support the Forest Service and the role of fire in our natural habitats, because without it, places like this, they simply couldn't exist. Join us next time as we continue to explore man's connection to the longleaf empire. Life at these elevations is existing on the fringe. It's hard to believe that life could even persist here, let alone thrive beautifully. Join me on today's expedition as we find out just how they do it, here on the rooftop of America, the Colorado Rockies.
Colorado is America's rooftop. It holds the vast majority of summits over 14,000 feet outside of Alaska, with 53 peaks. These elevations aren't just barren rocky crags, but hold vast areas of verdant alpine tundra and are home to some of the largest and most charismatic of America's fauna. We begin our exploration in the vast parks. That's a term for valley grasslands. These grasslands are maintained by their fine-textured soils and by the browsing and grazing of large animals. Just above the grasslands here on the eastern front is one of the most charismatic of woodlands in the West.
As you move up from those parks, those grasslands down below, on hot, dry slopes that are open to the sun, you find a really unique type of forest, one that is really characteristic of the West, where you have scattered ponderosa pine. This is a ponderosa pine woodland, one of the most amazing habitats that you'll find in the West. Wildlife is everywhere here. All those major large species that migrate up in elevation, like the bighorn sheep, the elk, they're all here too at different times of the year. And in this habitat is one of the best places to bird watch in this part of the country. We see violet green swallows. Violet green's very descriptive because of that beautiful coloration of this bird. Bright white, almost clown-like face with a brilliant green cap, green back, and then the lower parts of the wings and the lower part of the tail is this iridescent shining violet when it catches the light. It's probably the most beautiful swallow in North America, maybe the world. And a bird you won't miss is the black-billed magpie. Relative of jays, much larger species though. It makes a lot of noise. Even mountain bluebirds, the bluebird that I feel is the most beautiful of all bluebirds. And we've been watching a pair trading off, feeding young at the nest right here. They're cavity nesters, just like all of our bluebirds here in North America. And of course, the bird you can't miss, the one that's singing all around us, which is the western tanager, an incredibly beautiful two-tone bird. This bird with this bright orange head, yellow body, but related to the scarlet tanager and the summer tanager we have back home. But also chipmunks, squirrels, all kinds of wildlife in this habitat. And one of the chipmunks that we've seen here, possibly the least chipmunk, we have at least 3 species that occur in this zone of these mountains. So they're hard to tell apart, but I think the little guys we've been watching here are least chipmunks. Another cute little squirrel that you might mistake for a small prairie dog is the Wyoming ground squirrel. They make their burrows in these beautiful large grassy areas between the pines. This open structure, this forest, widely scattered trees, is primarily because this is an area that's exposed to fire. And unlike some of the forests higher above us here, these fires that burn through the ponderosa pine forest, they'll kill small trees, but they burn right under the large trees. Beautiful birds, beautiful animals, and you can't miss the plants. An incredible show of wildflowers if you're here in late spring, early summer. The ponderosa pine woodland just doesn't get the respect it deserves. Next time you're here, take some time to explore this habitat. As we move up the mountain into even higher altitudes, here on really droughty, oftentimes south-facing, dry, shallow soils, we enter one of the most characteristic communities of the Rocky Mountains, and that's this. This is lodgepole pine forest, and it's dominated by really a single species of tree. It's not the world's most diverse habitat, but ecologically, it's really cool because fire is absolutely necessary for the reproduction of lodgepole pine forest. Everything about this tree is made to burn. It has branches that hang way down close to the ground, trying to catch fire really and push it into the canopy where we get these horrible, huge conflagrations like we saw out in Yellowstone back in the 80s that was reported as destroying thousands upon thousands of acres. What it was doing was regenerating lodgepole pine forest. You see, when the fire burns up into the canopy, it heats up the cones. They pop open, they release seed, and there's no place better for a lodgepole pine to get a start than in the bare mineral soil that's left after a fire. So if you look behind me right here, you'll notice a young stand of even-aged lodgepole pines. There's probably a small fire that pushed up in here, maybe a decade or two ago, and regenerated a lodgepole pine stand. So we're standing in an older stand, a younger stand here, and you can really kind of tell where fires have burned based upon where the different age stands of lodgepole pine are. Well, it's not that different looking really than a lot of habitats across the Rockies and across much of the US. As we move up even further and into slightly moister habitats, I think you'll find things get even more familiar.
As we move higher, you'll notice some of the most characteristic and familiar wildlife. The raucous Steller's jay is a western specialist, as is the mountain cottontail, whose small ears and stocky body are great adaptations for the cold climate. The snowshoe hare, by contrast, is widespread and also quite common in the Northeast. Along watercourses, if you're patient, you'll encounter the frequently heard but seldom seen Lincoln sparrow. And if you're lucky, you may even spot the largest of America's deer.
When you get into moister situations, along streams, away from those hot, dry, south-facing slopes that are exposed to not just heat and drought, but fire, it looks even more familiar. You would have a hard time telling where I was if you didn't know what tree species these were, because we're essentially in a spruce fir forest. We've got a fir, and in this case, the fir is subalpine fir. It's a Rocky Mountain species, and the highest elevation spruce species in Colorado, Engelmann spruce. It looks like a balsam fir and a red spruce, or a balsam fir and a white spruce, but different species, endemic species, ones that are only found here in the Rocky Mountains, but they're joined by some very familiar plants. One of my favorite plants of this habitat is quaking aspen. That species is called quaking aspen because of the unique architecture of the leaf. It's incredible. It has a flattened petiole. That's what we call the stem to a leaf blade. And this flattened petiole provides some aerodynamic features to it. And then you have this flat blade so that wind can blow through the petiole without too much resistance, and then hits that blade and it starts quaking all over the place. And then nobody's quite sure why quaking aspen has quaking leaves, but you gotta admit, that's pretty doggone cool. Well, familiar sights, familiar sounds, and this place becomes even more familiar when you start to look at the herbs that carpet the ground.
I love the wildflowers that you can discover here in these subalpine forests. And one of the most beautiful and dainty of all orchids is right here. This is Calypso, or fairy slipper. Now, you don't have to come to Colorado to see this little orchid. The first time I saw this orchid was in Maine. But the plants that are in this habitat, in these spruce fir subalpine forests, a lot of them have distributions that don't just cover the spruce fir forests of the Rocky Mountains, but they envelop the whole boreal region of the world. And Calypso is one of those. You can find them where spruce fir forests occur at high latitudes all the way across the globe. This is a great habitat for orchids. Right here in this patch of forest, I've seen 4 or 5 species. Things like the small northern bog orchid and the northern coral root, 2 very tiny flowered orchids. And it's not just orchids that we find here. You can look at any patch of ground here and really see plants like twin flower, plants that we think of growing in this habitat throughout the boreal regions of North America. And believe it or not, I never knew this until today, but there's so many Calypso flowers here, I've stuck my nose into them. They're fragrant too, like good cheap perfume. And I've never seen so many. We're talking hundreds, maybe thousands, just in this little patch of spruce fir forest.
At the base of the trees here, you often find deep piles of broken cones. What on earth would do this? A squirrel, the American red squirrel. This is yet another species that's found throughout North America wherever spruce and fir occur. The spruce seeds form a large portion of the diet of the squirrel. It's often conspicuous because of its loud voice. We spend the night near tree line to allow ourselves a few more hours to acclimate to the elevation. The morning brought quite a surprise.
Life's a little different at 12,000 feet, and it only gets more ridiculous as you go up to the mountains. It's June 30th.
It's the end of June, it's almost July. We wake up this morning and we see snow. It snowed last night.
A lot of times we don't show you the rigors we have to go through to bring you what you see on television. This is it. I mean, we're out here in wind chills down in the teens.
It's freezing.
And we only go up from here. Flowers are blooming everywhere, but last night frozen solid, temperatures in the 20s, maybe even in the teens up top, and it's still just barely above freezing now at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. So imagine what these things have to go through. It's a really neat story to show the adaptations of these plants, but believe it or not, we gotta wait till the snow melts off of them.
We're struggling just to stand here and talk to one another
Yeah.
and stay warm, but there's life thriving here in alpine and subalpine habitats.
You got it.
I can't wait to see more of it.
Yeah, and we even had to find a sheltered place from the wind, because the wind up here, 40, 50 miles an hour, it's brutal.
Your nose is red.
Yeah, we need to get in the warm.
A few hours later, the temperature and strong sunlight have allowed the snow to melt and reveal the true beauty of the alpine flowers.
It's hard to believe this is the same little alpine bluebell that we saw covered with snow and frozen this morning. It's only a couple hours later, and it just goes to show you how resilient these plants have to be to withstand intense cold, even during the summer. All tundra is not the same everywhere in the world, and this is a great place to look at the different types of tundra that we see and what leads to diversity in these tundra systems. Yeah, this is very different than Arctic tundra. There's a lot of differences
between truly Arctic tundra plants and the plants of the tundra here in the alpine regions. One of the main differences is it gets cold at night here. It gets frigid, it freezes many nights during the summer here. The minute that sun goes down, it's bitterly cold. That's different than the Arctic because, see, in the Arctic at high latitudes, the sun's just going around and around. It's light 24 hours a day and not much difference between nighttime temperatures and daytime temperatures during the growing season. If you grow here, you have to be able to withstand that incredible cold that comes every time the sun goes down. There's more than just one type of alpine tundra. In fact, every single one is slightly different on every single mountaintop. And the tundra that exists here in the alpine zones of Colorado is very different from alpine tundra that you find in Montana or New Mexico, up in Canada, or even in Alaska. They're each different because they each have regional climatic differences. There's latitudinal differences that impact them, and even moisture differences. But there's also differences on the sites themselves. You know, the side of the hill you're on can make a huge difference in what plants can survive. You can be on the leeward side or the windward side of a hill. And that makes a huge difference because on a windward side, all the snow's going to be blown off and you're going to be just absolutely pounded in the wintertime with bitterly cold winds and negative 30-degree Fahrenheit temperatures that just desiccate everything. On the leeward side, on the side of the mountain that the wind isn't blowing predominantly on in the wintertime, you get snowfields that develop. And snow provides a cushion, a blanket that will protect those plants from the damaging winds until it melts during the summer. And many plants grow under snow that don't grow in exposed fell fields. And then there's the local conditions. Something as small as this rock can make all the difference in where on this slope an alpine bluebell can grow. That rock, during the wintertime, you will actually have a little mini snowdrift that will form behind that rock, and it, just like the snowfields that develop on the leeward sides of the hills, will protect the plants that are here from the bitter cold. If you look just on the other side of the rock, there's nothing but cushion forming plants because right over there it's exposed to the brunt of the wind. But here there's a little warm and still pocket where something as beautiful as this little bluebell is able to survive. Lots of topographical and microtopographical variation on a site all work together to create the incredibly biodiverse, structurally diverse tundra that we see in the alpine zones of Colorado. That little guy is a young yellow-bellied marmot. If you think it looks a lot like a groundhog, it's because groundhogs are marmots. We just don't call them marmots in the East. Here in Colorado, we have yellow-bellied marmots, and they're very conspicuous. This large, lumbering woodchuck out here on these alpine tundra areas. And just like groundhogs, they're out here consuming a lot of above-ground vegetation. So they're feeding on grasses and herbs, broadleaf forbs out here. They don't stray far from their burrows. And these yellow-bellied marmots have a very cool way that they deal with living in this extremely harsh habitat. They hibernate. And if you're going to hibernate during the harsh times of the year here, during wintertime, you're going to have to hibernate for up to 8 months because that's how long winter lasts here. And an animal that has to hibernate for 8 months either needs to have a food reserve or they need to have a reserve of energy. And that reserve of energy for this animal is fat. So a young guy like this is going to have to double his weight just to survive the winter because they consume 50% of their body weight. And that's fat that they're using, metabolizing to have energy to survive the winter. Hibernation isn't exactly what you think it is. They don't just lower their metabolism down and go to sleep all winter long. They wake up from time to time. Even though their body temperature has dropped lower, even though their metabolic rate has gone way down, they're still using energy. So you have to store it up, and this animal does it with fat. Yellow-bellied marmots may look like they're not the most intelligent things up here, but this incredibly cute little animal is actually very sophisticated socially and vocally. They make a number of different calls, and they communicate back and forth about predators, about what's going on, and for territoriality. And so the sharp chirps that you hear in the alpine zone, a lot of times they're made by this very cool and very beautiful marmot. Finally, we're able to drive all the way to the top of the highest paved road in America.
Well, here we are. We made it up to near the summit. Actually, we're at 14,130 feet, right near the summit of Mount Evans, at the top of the road. Throngs of people come up here because it's an easy place to achieve 14,000 feet. And you get to experience just how difficult it is for those plants and animals that eke out a living up here. They're not even eking out a living, they're thriving up here. How do they do it? What do they have to deal with? Here, you got to deal with the elevation. The sunlight that's beating down on us, it'll burn us in a heartbeat because there's not as much atmosphere between us and the sun. You don't think about how powerful the radiation is up here, and plants and animals have to deal with that. Well, in addition to the sunlight, the windy conditions out here expose these plants to dryness. It blows 40, 50 miles an hour regularly, sustained up here, and winds can achieve speeds of well over 100 miles an hour. Think about what it's like in the winter at 35 below zero and 100-mile-an-hour winds. So windy conditions, the cold, the sun, and the oxygen. You've probably heard people talk about the fact that when you get up to these elevations, oh, well, there's thin air up there, or there's no oxygen. Well, the truth is, there's exactly the same percentage oxygen in the atmosphere here as there is at sea level, still around 21% oxygen, but the barometric pressure is much lower up here. And that means the gas molecules are much farther apart. When you get up to these elevations, your blood oxygen saturation goes way down, and you'll get dizzy, you'll get a headache, you'll suffer from altitude sickness if you don't take it easy when you get up here. The partial pressure of oxygen in your lungs is what's driving down the ability of the oxygen to be absorbed into your bloodstream effectively. Now, you'll acclimate to that in a week or so, but it was kind of fun for us to use this meter that we brought with us to test our oxygen saturation. And coming from sea level up to here, we ranged anywhere from around 68 to 70% saturated up to 90, 91, 92% saturated. And that is what it's all about up here. Less oxygen in your bloodstream means you can't do things nearly as rigorously as you can at sea level. There's a whole different set of challenges here than Arctic plants and animals face. And it's just amazing to me that these creatures can adapt to all the challenges that are posed by a place like this. What's more interesting is the fact that they don't just adapt here, they don't just survive, they thrive. Mount Evans is definitely the easiest place in North America to observe mountain goats. They'll just walk right up to you almost, oblivious that you're even there. These guys are just choosing to come close to us. You've got the little young goat there, and one that's maybe a year or two old coming up behind, and then the female here. And when you think about an animal that's well adapted to living in these harsh climates, there's very few that are better adapted than a mountain goat. This time of year, the coat on these animals is shedding, and they're getting a little bit shaggy. Mountain goats have that incredibly dense, thick fur that protects them against the wind and against the cold. It's frigid up here today. They're not feeling it. They're also perfectly adapted to living in these rocky habitats. They specialize in grazing in areas that are sheer cliffs, where they're looking to browse on herbs and grasses. Even their hooves, made for climbing up here precariously on high rocky ledges. The sole of their feet is rubbery to give it traction. An incredible animal that's made for these kind of habitats. We oftentimes think of these as being true goats. They're not true goats. They're in a group of animals called goat antelopes, related to similar creatures that live in Asia. Well, I think they're down here in this old roadbed licking salts, minerals out of the rocks and the soils that are here. And that's a very important thing because they don't get enough in their diet. Mount Evans may be the easiest place to see these goats. They may not belong here. There's very little evidence that mountain goats ever occurred naturally in Colorado. And these goats here were absolutely introduced by people. So that action may be changing the tundra.
We leave the craggy summit behind because we need to descend a bit to get to the real showplace of alpines.
So how do these alpine plants do it? How do they put up with all the sun, the wind, the rain, the incredible dryness because of the blowing wind, the solar radiation, and the cold, especially at night? Well, there's syndromes that we see in these alpine plants. Even completely unrelated species will fit a pattern just to survive
here in this harsh climate. And one of the ones that has the largest flowers up here in the Colorado alpine is this plant right here, and it illustrates very well some of the adaptations and the syndromes that we see in alpine plants. This is Old Man of the Mountain. It's an incredibly huge flower that this plant has, and that is something that transcends almost all of the barriers out here, almost all of the families of plants. Big flowers are the rule up here on plants that aren't cushion forming in the alpine habitats. And it's all about attracting pollinators. You have to stick out in a short window of time, so these big flowers are real cues for those pollinators to hone in on. And when we take a close look at Old Man of the Mountain, what we see is that all portions of this plant are completely covered with gray, silky hairs. A lot of plants up here have hairy leaves and stems and buds, and we think that's probably to be able to withstand the dramatic shifts in temperature up here. You gotta remember, it freezes at night. And if it's gonna freeze most nights, or some nights even here at this elevation, you have to be able to withstand that. And having those trichomes, plant hairs if you will, all along the stem means that you're increasing the boundary layer around the tissue. Kind of the same way a mountain goat's coat, or my coat for that matter, blocks the wind, holds in the warmth. Those trichomes will do the same thing. The wind out here, even though it can be cold, it's incredibly drying. And that's what's the real challenge for plants up here. Those hairs will help to increase the boundary layer and help to increase the humidity right around the stem and keep the wind from beating right up against the plant's leaves and stem tissue. It keeps it safe from the drying winds. So an incredible adaptation. Even the sky pilot that's right beside me here with these blue flowers has leaves that are covered with little tiny hairs and highly compound leaves that stick straight up in the air. They fall into a syndrome. This is one strategy, but a very common strategy. The one that occurs on the most exposed slopes is just as interesting, but very different. It's hard to imagine a more exposed location than this, a ridge top where the wind is continually just ripping through here, drying things out, and even blowing away the snow in the wintertime. And this gravelly and sort of rocky community where all the snow gets blown away is generally called a fell field. If you grow in such a precarious location as this, you have to really take advantage of the ground. And that's exactly what this incredibly low-growing sandwort is doing right here. This plant is barely 2 millimeters tall and forms this huge cushion around this rock. It may be ancient, maybe hundreds of years old, and it's an excellent example of a cushion-forming plant. Now, staying that low will get you out of the wind, and that's key here, is staying out of the drying effect of the wind and, of course, the desiccation and the cold in the wintertime. But it's more than just that. This low-growing habit also takes advantage of the heat that's provided naturally by the ground. This is a plant that actually takes advantage of natural geothermal energy all day long when it's sunny out. The sun is beating down on the ground and warming it up. So much so that if we look at the temperature of the ground today, when it's in the lower to mid 40s, and check the ground, we're gonna see 82 degrees. When we look at the temperature of the plant itself, 67 degrees. So the plant is actually absorbing a lot of heat from the sun. And that's warming the plant and it's warming the ground. And at night, when that temperature plummets, this plant takes advantage of the heat of the ground to survive those cold nights. Well, a plant that's only 2 millimeters tall isn't going to produce a giant flower, no matter how hard it tries. And these plants make up for not producing a giant flower to attract pollinators by producing lots of them. These cushions just become a field of snowy white when they're in flower to grab the pollinators' attention. Incredible adaptation and taking advantage of geothermal heat. Surviving the rigors of an average year here is hard enough for the life that makes its home in the Rockies. Join me next time as we delve even deeper into the ecology and into the challenges that life here faces. I'm Patrick McMillan, wishing you your own exciting expedition. This is Catalina Island, and it just happens to be right smack dab in the middle of one of the world's great biodiversity hotspots. It has all the challenges ecologically that we think of islands having, but instead of dwindling, life here is thriving. In fact, This place serves as a refuge for life. Does that sound too good to be true? Join me on today's expedition as we journey beyond Avalon on an island that seems like it came right out of a natural history fairy tale.
It's hard to believe that only one short ferry ride away, about 23 miles from Long Beach, California, the heart of LA, is a place that's as unique and different as Catalina Island.
My associate producer, Katie Mixon, has already been on the island. She's been scouting locations with representatives from the Catalina Island Conservancy. We meet and begin our journey across this enchanted island.
As soon as you step off the ferry here on Catalina, you enter the charming town of Avalon. And the neat part about this place to me is that it tends to sort of replicate a lot of the patterns we see in nature on islands. When you think about islands, a lot of times you think about there's a limit. They have a finite amount of space, finite amount of resources. So if you visit Avalon expecting to go on a vacation here and get everything you need for your vacation, it ain't gonna happen here because the stores are smaller. There's less space, less resources, less choice. Each island's unique, and this one's unique in so many ways.
So many ways. As soon as you get off the ferry, you can visually see that uniqueness by even the mode of transportation, how people get around in Avalon. We have to actually take golf carts. People are driving around in golf carts, they're walking, they're taking bikes, and that's because there is less resources, less space for people to move around, and less choices, which is what you find in animal populations as well.
That's right, and even the visitors. This place receives over 1 million visitors a year. It's just a little ways from the second largest population center in the United States. And it's almost like what we see in nature with migratory songbirds and waterfowl. You know, 1 million people come here, and what they're doing when they're here, they're consuming resources, they're bringing things into the island, they're changing things just by simply being here. And that's just what we see in nature.
It is, and this town is charming. It's eclectic with all the different people in the shops and the really cool walkways. I feel like I'm in a different decade. It's just a beautiful town, but as charming and as fun as Avalon is, there's a lot to see in the interior. I've already seen some of it.
I haven't, and I want to go see it.
And I can't wait to explore it with you. So Patricia from the Conservancy is waiting for us.
All right, let's
go check it out.
The mission of the Catalina Island Conservancy is to be a responsible steward of its lands through a balance of conservation, education, and recreation. Founded in 1972 as a nonprofit organization, the Catalina Island Conservancy is one of the oldest private land trusts in Southern California. It protects 88% of Catalina Island, including more than 62 miles of unspoiled beaches and secluded coves. The Conservancy is a leader in conservation programs to protect and restore endangered species and threatened habitats.
Avalon is quite a bit different than your typical California town. But even when you leave the village of Avalon and enter the backcountry, this land that the Catalina Island Conservancy manages, this 42,000-acre wilderness area, it's also different from anything else. You don't have to be a plant ecologist. When Katie and I first walked out here, both of us being familiar with that coastal sage scrub back on the mainland, we're kind of struck by how different this place is. There's lots of plants and animals here that you don't find anywhere else. So this habitat I'm standing in, this is called soft chaparral or coastal sage scrub. And a lot of the plants that are here are the same plants that we find right over there on the mainland, only 23 miles away in these coastal habitats. We have black sage, we have white sage, and here and there we have California sagebrush. But when you look at the actual aspect of this place, there's all of these light whitish colored shrubs with these beautiful purple flowers. That's not anything you see anywhere else on Earth. And here, it's one of the aspect dominants. This is Yerba Santa. Now, Yerba Santa is a group of plants that you do find in coastal sage scrub, but this plant, Trask's Yerba Santa, is confined just to the Channel Islands. In fact, just this island. And it's not alone. When we look around this habitat, you see bush mallows, you see cacti, much more cacti than we see in coastal sage scrub over on the mainland. And it's much more open and easier to walk through than those that you see over on the mainland. There's a manzanita here, Catalina manzanita. almost like a regular manzanita with that nice, shiny, reddish bark. But when you look at the stem, completely covered with hairs. And this is the only place on Earth you can see it. Even this incredibly showy yellow flower here, this is a poppy relative, but it gets to be tree size. We have tree poppies on the mainland, and we have a special tree poppy here. This one, island tree poppy. It's found only here on Catalina and on one other Channel Island. So tons of Catalina Island endemics, tons of Channel Island endemics, and it's just enough that when you walk out here, it's different. It's naturally different. Catalina, it's quirky, and I love it. To really begin to understand the real nature of Catalina, you have to understand something about its origins. Catalina is what we call a true oceanic island. That means it's always been separated from the continent. It's not part of the continental landmass. And despite the fact that we're only 23 miles from the mainland here, separated by a little narrow channel, it's never been connected. So for the last 5 million years, that's about the age we think Catalina is, this island's been sitting here. And when it rose up out of the ocean, it was already isolated. So basically with an oceanic island, you're starting with a blank slate. And that's super important in trying to understand what's here and why it's so unique. You see, the first step towards really becoming an island endemic is getting here. So how do you colonize a true oceanic island, one that starts out as a blank slate? How do things get here? You have to cross a pretty broad swath of water. There's a couple ways you can do that. One of the most obvious is with wings. If you can fly, you're much more likely to end up in a place like this. And so what gets here has to be able to cross that channel. And so, of course, seabirds and shorebirds get here all the time. And they're no different than their cousins that we see attached to the mainland because they come and go as they please. But when you look at songbirds, some of the songbirds that we've been watching all around us today are pretty surprising. This chaparral and sage scrub is completely full of western tanagers. I've been watching them all morning. And some of these birds that get here that are really terrestrial birds have actually become a little bit different because they like Catalina so well that they stayed around and they're not readily colonized over and over again by migratory populations. So things like the orange-crowned warblers and the bewixed wrens here are their own unique population, separate from what we see on the mainland. Insects, great example of something that comes over via wings, but also wind. Insects sometimes will just get carried across that 23-mile channel because wind currents will pick up things that even aren't great flyers and carry them up into the upper air currents and get them across that channel. That happens with plants too. Think about the dandelions in your backyard. Well, there's lots of relatives of dandelions here on the island. The giant coreopsis, the silver lace. Those species have winged seeds that use the air currents to get around. And so some of the plants no doubt got here because of wind. But the really unique ones, the ones that are difficult to think about, like squirrels, how did they get here? They got here by way of water. They floated. All along the coast of California, there's large beds of kelp. The dead and dislodged kelp float, and those animals that are likely to be along the side of the shore might catch a ride over here. I happened to be messing around in these little piles of kelp and found this little lizard. And something like this may colonize the island repeatedly, maybe a couple times a century. It'll ride a piece of kelp or rack over across that channel and hit the island. Something a little larger, like a squirrel, will need a larger bundle to ride across the channel. It's much less likely to happen. Matter of fact, it's like winning the sweepstakes if you get here. And that's what we call that type of colonization. We actually call it sweepstakes immigration because the pregnant squirrel that landed here landed on an island that had no competition. It won the sweepstakes, but the odds of getting across that channel were so low that it doesn't happen very often. It may have only happened one time in the history of this island in the last 5 million years. The thing about 5 million years is something that's even unlikely to happen, eventually it will happen. Just today, we've seen a caracara, the first record for that bird in the Channel Islands, and happened to appear here during our visit. But that just illustrates that point that given enough time, even tiny odds are overcome, and something like a caracara will end up on Catalina Island. And in a geologic timescale, when you start talking about 5 million years, that's how these species little lizards and squirrels, get their start on an island that's detached from the coast. And that's the beginning of all the incredible endemism that we see on Catalina. So for roughly 5 million years, Catalina Island has been here above the ocean. And all during that time, it's been colonized repeatedly by plants and animals that managed to beat the odds and managed to get to this little isolated piece of land. But what happens when they get here? Well, this beautiful tree behind me, Catalina Island ironwood, tells a lot of that story. This incredible tree is in the rose family and is a member of the genus Lionothamnus. And the neat thing about this is it's the only living member of the genus. There's only one species today. This genus, this group of plants, was once found throughout the southwestern United States. All the other species have gone extinct, and the last one, the only one remaining, is this, restricted to the Channel Islands. There's two distinct forms that this plant grows in, and this form, with these simple leaves, is found only on Catalina. The leaves don't have any divisions to them. And as you move north in the Channel Islands, you'll find that those from the northern Channel Islands have leaves that are divided almost like a fern. This tree produces huge panicles of white flowers, and they look a lot like elderberry flowers, even though it doesn't look much like a rose. That's the group it's part of. And it's very distinctive, not only because of the simple leaves and the large, showy groups of white flowers, but also the bark, which is highly shredding in these long strips. Sometimes we think about subspecies as being species that are on their way to becoming distinct species themselves. And that's because of the isolation, the small population sizes, and the pressures that are put on those populations. The interesting thing about islands is that chance is everything. Managing to get here is the first stage. But then if you have a small population and all of the plants that colonize the island happen to have undivided leaves, you'll never have divided leaves. You're stuck with just those few genes that are in what we call a founder population. That's called a founder effect that cause all of your descendants to share that trait. So chance plays a huge role, but chance also with islands can be very detrimental because you see islands tend to have high immigration rates. They also tend to have high extinction rates. Luckily, these Channel Islands were here to receive Lionothamnus and allow us to enjoy it today. Somehow, this place has managed to provide just the right habitat to allow these trees to survive here amongst the sheltering hills and canyons of Catalina. So what happens if you actually do win the sweepstakes? You manage to get to Catalina Island. Well, when you get here, a lot of times there's no competition. If you're a small animal and you're an herbivore or an omnivore, something that eats vegetation like squirrels, then you're absolutely free from competition and in a lot of cases predators. So small things that get to islands, things like squirrels, a lot of times undergo something we call gigantism, meaning they get larger. And you don't have to think hard about this to think of some good examples. Things like the Galapagos tortoise. Here on Catalina, gigantism has happened with these endemic squirrels. These squirrels from Catalina are much larger than the squirrels of the same species that we find on the mainland. And there's another giant here too. The Catalina Island California quail is about 10% larger than the quail that we find on the mainland. So when you get to an island and there's a lot of vacant space and there's little competition, those that are larger may have a better chance at survival and a better chance at reproduction. And think about it, the bigger guy gets better territory and he's able to garner more females. So what happens if you're a predator and you make it to this island? Well, the thing about islands is that there's an opposite trend. Predators in a space that's limited will have a problem if there's not enough food resources. And on islands, being a predator means a lot of times you get smaller. Well, I gotta say I owe Katie one this morning because she was walking along here along Silver Canyon and she says, I think I see a rattlesnake.
Patrick, Patrick, come back.
I've wanted to see this since we got to the island. I've been looking nonstop for a southern Pacific rattlesnake, and Katie was lucky enough to see one when she was here with Colin earlier in the spring, taking some video.
Yeah.
Another specialty of Catalina Island, and a lot of people are scared of rattlesnakes. A lot of people think they'll chase you down. They don't, but this one is really cryptic, Katie. It's built to match the environment, so it was really hard to spot.
And he did that perfectly. The way he was coiled up and staying really still right in front of a rock was blending in, camouflaging completely. And that's why they're built to look this way, is to protect themselves and to help them find their prey.
Yeah, and he's a little older than you would think from his size. I mean, he's shed 7, 8, maybe 9 times, which lends me to believe that he's probably several years old. And this snake, again, is unique to Catalina Island. Even though southern Pacific rattlesnakes are found throughout Southern California, it's one of the more common species. Recently, researchers here have found that their venom is a bit different, and their behavior is really different. Notice he's not rattling, and he rattled a little bit when I was stirring him up, but he was striking way more than he was rattling, and that's a behavioral difference between this rattlesnake and a southern Pacific rattlesnake on the mainland. Maybe that has to do with there being less predators out here on the island, and that habit of rattling to warn may not be as necessary out here. An incredible animal, and I just love seeing rattlesnakes. They're beautiful. And to think that maybe we have a new subspecies, a subspecies that hasn't been recognized before, of this beautiful southern Pacific rattlesnake here on Catalina sort of shows you that there's still a lot to be found. There's still a lot to be learned on Catalina. And just a little respect when you're walking through the shrubs, the bushes, is probably a good idea when you're here on Catalina Island. They won't hurt you unless you're trying to hurt them. So often, the part that's left out of this story is the boots on the ground conservation part of actually applying research. So I'm really lucky to be able to talk to Tyler Dvorak, who is one of those people who are out here day in, day out working on so many projects. And your primary project right now, we've talked a lot about the terrestrial issues here on Catalina, but you're working on this sort of interface between something that breeds and something that uses the water, right? So your main project is working with murrelets.
It is. I have a great love for birds and interest in ornithology, and this murrelet project kind of just fell in our laps to actually look at a species that was little known on Catalina. We didn't know for sure whether they even nested or bred here on the island. The leading researchers in the field had a good idea that they were through on-the-water surveys of nighttime congregations that there are birds here during the breeding season around Catalina. So we end up joining forces with the California Institute of Environmental Studies. We ended up then through that project finding the first ever nests that were known from the main island of Catalina, and that was great news, and that's just the start of things.
Explain to us, how are they nesting? Because I think a lot of people are shocked by murrelets and what they do.
The murrelets are crevice nesters, and they utilize concealed nest sites that are in cliff walls and back in sea caves, and they'll be at the base of some steep cliffs. A lot of time there are scree piles, just
piles of
rubble and rock, large boulders, sometimes the size of you or I. But way back in under this jumble of boulders, there's crevices and holes that the light can't get in there, and other predators can't, really find their way in there. And then you have to try to get your arm in there with a flashlight or get a mirror back in there and look for an eggshell fragment or a hatched eggshell, or when you're lucky, actually a bird incubating, or maybe a chick with one of its parents. And we have set up transects that are actually able to be replicated on the water at night, where we spotlight for birds and we count them along these transects at certain times during the year and over multiple years to try to get an idea on trends in the population. Then once we do that, hopefully we'll be gaining more and more nest sites to monitor that we find, and we can start looking at trends in the overall population of birds congregating at the island, along with the success of the birds nesting, and look at things like what are the limiting factors for this species here on Catalina. For this species, a place like Catalina, it may not be ideal habitat for them, but it's very important for such a small, isolated species that only has possibly at the most 8 or 9 breeding islands anywhere in the world that it breeds on. And with some of its main islands where the majority of the world population living, for this short breeding season, you have things like oil spills and other disasters that could really affect a great proportion of the species in the world, but just at a very small place.
Right.
So every very small little place that this bird is nesting is really important.
Man is not a new immigrant to this island. Katie takes me to see a site that demonstrates this poignantly.
So we're right below the airport,
Yep.
and the place I wanted to take you to is right over here. I think I can see it.
Yep.
Patrick, I brought you here because I found something really cool that I wanted to show you. When I was in Catalina back in April and exploring the island, I found this rock quarry, and it illustrates what you're always telling me about how people's choices make impacts. And this impact
It's written in stone. Yeah, you can see it
Exactly.
written in stone here. This is a soapstone quarry.
Yeah.
And what's really neat here is we can see, just locked in time, the way that people thousands of years ago, we're talking at least 2,500 years ago, and
Probably longer than that.
7,000 years ago, they think, they were quarrying here on this island. And they would take and scrape away a soapstone bowl by creating the outside of the bowl, chucking it off of that by just scraping around and creating the bowl and then breaking it off and then hollowing it out on the inside.
I wonder how long that process took.
A while, yeah, a while. But the reason soapstone is so important is that soapstone could be used to cook. So you can actually put soapstone with a high talc content, and that's what's in the rock here on Catalina that makes it so valuable, is it has lots of talc in it. And so you could put that soapstone with high talc content right into a fire or under heat and use it to bake and to cook in, and it doesn't pop, it doesn't shatter, it doesn't explode.
Right.
When the temperature changes, it allows it to actually absorb and change with the heat without breaking. So an extremely valuable innovation. I mean, I've heard it compared to a microwave of the
It could
early
change
times.
what their diet was. They could get higher nutrition from the
Right.
foods that they were eating.
Right.
And I hear that they shared it with other people, not just on Catalina. They
Right.
could actually export this soapstone that they made.
And they've actually found soapstone that they think came from Catalina as far away as the Colorado River in northern Arizona, Four Corners region.
What an impact that a small amount of people can make on a small island here off the coast of California, all the way back on the mainland.
Yeah, it's so cool to see. We're not going to get any closer than this, but because it's an archaeological site, and we do want to respect that. But you know, I always try to remind people as often as possible that human beings have been having an impact, our choices, for a long time. You have to remember, people have been here in the Channel Islands for 9,000 to 12,000 years. And their choices in the past have impacted significantly, and not necessarily negatively,
Right.
but significantly, the natural world that we see all around us. To really understand just how important humans have been in the past and how important human choice was and how important your choices are today, you don't have to look any farther than the local oak trees here on the island. This incredible, huge, beautiful oak is McDonald oak. And it's a Channel Island endemic. It's only found here in these islands, but this one's history is pretty interesting, and it's totally dependent on the previous actions of mankind. You see, this oak produces a pretty decent sized acorn. And in fact, the acorn's kind of in between the size of the local endemic, the little scrubby species here that we call island scrub oak, and another species that's found on the islands but also on the mainland, a larger oak with huge acorns that's called valley oak. It turns out that this incredible plant is the product of the meeting of valley oak and island scrub oak. And it's only because valley oak was introduced to this island by humans that these two things ever came into contact. See, valley oak produces enormous acorns. And even though we today don't consider acorns to be part of the all-American diet, Native Americans were heavily dependent on acorns as a stable carbohydrate source. They made flour out of them, they ground them up, they roasted them, they did all kinds of things with them. They were a plentiful and abundant food resource, similar to what we'd use wheat for or corn for today. Well, because Native Americans introduced valley oaks here to these islands, possibly thousands of years ago, these oaks came into contact with the local scrub oak, and they produced hybrids that have a pretty extensive large acorn. And if you compare the leaves, if you compare the fruit, virtually any part of this tree, you'll see that it's exactly intermediate, exactly between what we see in the scrub oak and the valley oak. And that's this one, the McDonald oak. So even these incredibly gorgeous, large, shade-casting oaks, the McDonald oak, that are found only in the Channel Islands, are the product of the choice that human beings made so long ago.
People have been a part of Catalina for thousands of years, shaping the environment, changing, adding, and subtracting from the diversity. From foxes to oaks to the strange and seemingly out-of-place bison that roam Catalina today, the hand of man is visible everywhere you look. Join us next time as we continue to explore the relationship between man and the unique life of Catalina.